She was a nun for 32 years, she prayed, fasted, obeyed every rule, and was certain she was going to heaven. But when her heart stopped for nearly 8 minutes, Jesus spoke to her neither of rituals nor of religion. He showed her something terrifying, souls being lost because they chose comfort over love. My name is Gabriela Fernanda Lopez Torres, and for 32 years of my life, I was Sister Gabriela of the Congregation of the Handmaids of Mary Help of Christians in Guadalajara, Jalisco. What I am about to share with you is not easy to tell, because I know many will not believe it. Others will think I have lost my mind, and some may feel I am betraying my religious vocation, but after what I experienced, remaining silent would be an even greater betrayal, not to my order or the church, but to the truth revealed to me in a way so powerful that it transformed every fiber of my being. For more than 3 decades, I served God with total devotion. I woke up every morning at 4:30 for dawn prayers. I dedicated my entire youth to prayer, service, and absolute obedience to my congregation's rules. My life was a perfectly orchestrated ritual of masses, rosaries, novenas, and acts of charity. I knew every verse by heart, every saint in the liturgical calendar, and every tradition of our Catholic faith. I took pride in my spiritual discipline and felt a deep peace knowing I had chosen the right path, the narrow path that leads to heaven. But nothing, absolutely nothing, in all those years of theological training, intense spiritual retreats, and perpetual vows made with tears of joy, prepared me for what I would discover that spring day when my heart stopped beating and my soul was brought into the very presence of Jesus Christ. It was an ordinary Wednesday during Lent, one of those days when the Guadalajara sun beats down fiercely early on, yet the air still holds a hint of the morning's freshness. We had just finished the 6 a.m. Mass in our convent chapel, and I was heading to the communal kitchen to help prepare breakfast for the elderly sisters who could no longer care for themselves. The convent was an old building with long corridors paved into lava tiles, worn down by decades of footsteps, thick adobe walls painted a yellowish-white by the passage of time, and high windows with wrought iron grills that let in shafts of golden light filled with floating dust motes. The place had a distinctive scent, a blend of melted candle wax, withered altar flowers, and that peculiar, musty aroma of old age found in colonial buildings. I remember thinking about the priest's sermon from Mass. He had spoken of the importance of penance and sacrifice as a path to salvation, a subject I knew well, for my entire life had been built upon that theological foundation. As I walked down the main corridor, I felt a strange sensation, something I had never experienced before. It was as if the floor beneath my feet had become unstable, as if I were walking on cotton rather than solid tile. My vision began to blur at the edges, the golden light streaming through the windows grew blindingly bright, and a high-pitched buzzing started in my ears, a constant ringing that drowned out all other sounds in the convent. I tried to lean against the wall, but my legs would no longer obey me. They felt like jelly, weak, unable to hold my weight. The burden of my own body became impossible to bear. The sensation of instability quickly transformed into something far more terrifying. A sharp, piercing pain shot through my chest, as if someone had driven an icy dagger straight into my heart. It was not a superficial pain, but something deep and visceral that seemed to originate from the very core of my being. I tried to scream, but my throat was constricted, as though an invisible hand were squeezing it tight. No air could enter or leave my lungs. There was only a terrible tightness that intensified by the second. I fell to my knees on the cold tiled floor, and the impact echoed through the empty hallway. My hands desperately groped for something to cling to. They found the rosary I always wore at my waist and clutched it so tightly that the wooden beads dug into my palm. The pain in my chest intensified until it became unbearable. It felt as if a giant fist were crushing my heart. Each beat was an explosion of agony radiating outward to my arms, my neck, and my jaw. The light in the hallway began to dim, not like the gradual onset of nightfall, but as if someone were slowly turning down a dimmer switch, lowering the intensity of reality itself. The sounds of the convent, the distant chanting of the sisters still praying in the chapel, the clatter of pots in the kitchen, the barking of dogs in the street, all began to fade. They grew increasingly distant until they were nothing more than a muffled echo, as if rising from the bottom of a deep well. My vision narrowed to a tight tunnel. Directly ahead, I could see only a small image of the wooden crucifix hanging at the far end of the hallway, the figure of Jesus nailed to the cross, his head bowed and his arms outstretched. That was the last thing my physical eyes beheld before everything plunged into total blackness, a darkness so absolute and complete that it was as if the entire universe had been extinguished. But that darkness did not last long, or perhaps it lasted an eternity. Time had ceased to have any meaning. What happened next is almost impossible to put into words, because our human language was created to describe earthly, physical, material experiences, and what I experienced lay beyond all that. The blackness began to change. It didn't exactly brighten, but rather became less dense, as if made of a substance capable of becoming translucent. And then, I began to realize something extraordinary. I no longer felt pain. The crushing pain in my chest had vanished completely. The tightness in my throat was gone. The weakness in my legs no longer existed. In fact, I no longer had legs. I had no body at all. I was pure consciousness, pure existence without a physical form. And the most amazing thing of all was that this lack of a body caused me neither panic nor fear. On the contrary, I felt freer than I ever had in my entire life. It was as if, for 52 years, I had been carrying a heavy metal suit without realizing it, and suddenly it had been removed, leaving me to float light as a feather, as a thought, as a sigh. The translucent darkness began to fill with a soft luminosity that did not come from any specific source but seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. It was not like sunlight, nor like the candlelight I knew. It was a light alive, a light that possessed consciousness and intent, enveloping me in a warmth that penetrated to the very core of my being. Within that light, I began to discern shapes, not solid forms, but rather presences, as if the light itself were shifting in density, creating landscapes that were not quite physical places yet felt like real environments. There were what appeared to be infinite fields stretching beyond any horizon, yet these were not fields of earth and grass, but expanses of pure energy undulating like oceans of liquid light in hues unknown on earth, colors nameless because the human eye was never designed to perceive them. As I floated in that timeless, spaceless ocean of light, a presence began to manifest before me. At first, it was merely an intensification of the radiance, a point where the light grew brighter, more concentrated, more intense. But as my consciousness adjusted to this new reality, the presence began to take on a more defined form, and then I saw him. I saw Jesus, but not the Jesus of the plaster statues in our chapel, nor the Jesus of Renaissance paintings with pale skin and blue eyes, nor the Jesus of stained glass windows, clad in spotless robes with a serene expression. This Jesus was, all at once, more human and more divine than any artist could ever hope to capture. His presence was so overwhelming that, had I still possessed a physical body, I would have instantly fallen prostrate. He radiated a majesty that made all the kings and emperors of history seem like children playing at make-believe. Yet, at the same time, his eyes held a profound tenderness mingled with something that shook me to my very soul, an immense sadness, a sorrow that seemed to encompass all the suffering of humanity. His face possessed a beauty that transcended any human concept. His eyes held entire universes of wisdom. When he looked at me, I felt as though I were being seen to the very depths of my being. Every thought I had ever had, every action I had taken, every hidden motive, every moment of doubt, every instant of faith, it was all laid bare before him, and there was no way to hide a thing. And in that gaze, I saw something that left me frozen. I saw that he knew exactly who I truly was, and what I saw reflected in his eyes was not just love, it was also an urgent warning. He did not speak in words, at least, not the way humans do. There was no sound of a voice, no movement of lips, yet his communication was clearer and more direct than any conversation I had ever had. It was as if his thoughts were being transmitted directly into my consciousness, as if his mind were touching mine. In that contact, all information flowed instantly, without the need for translation into language. and the first thing he communicated left me completely shaken. He showed me my life, not as a hazy memory or a series of highlights. I saw every moment of my 52 years playing out simultaneously, as if every second of my existence were happening at once on different screens of light surrounding me on all sides. I saw the 7-year-old girl I once was, kneeling in the church in my hometown of Morelia, Michoacan, praying fervently during Sunday Mass. I saw the 15-year-old teenager who decided to dedicate her life to God following a profound experience at a spiritual retreat. I saw the 21-year-old young woman taking her perpetual vows, with tears rolling down my cheeks while my parents wept in the front pew. I saw all the days of prayer, all the rosaries recited, all the masses attended, all the hours of service to the sick and the poor. I saw my discipline, my sacrifice, my absolute dedication to following the rules of my religious order. But then Jesus began to show me something different, something that made me tremble in a way I had never experienced before. He showed me the moments in my life when my actions, or, worse yet, my inaction, had caused real harm to the souls he loved, and I was not merely observing these moments as distant memories. I was experiencing them from the perspective of the people I had hurt. I saw, with devastating clarity, that afternoon when a young single mother came to the convent seeking help because she had no way to feed her 3 children. Did I remember that day? Of course I remembered it, but what I had forgotten was the absolute desperation in her eyes. Now, I didn't just see the desperation, I felt it. Jesus made me experience exactly what she felt when I handed her a small bag of beans and rice along with a pamphlet on the importance of premarital chastity. I felt her humiliation, her shame, and the cutting pain of being judged in her moment of greatest vulnerability. But the most terrible part was what came next. He showed me how that experience drove her completely away from the faith, how, in that moment, something inside her broke, a connection to the divine that was never restored, and how, years later, in her desperation and loneliness, she made choices that led her down a dark path, a path she might have avoided if I, had shown her true compassion instead of religious judgment. I saw the impact of that single interaction spreading like ripples in a pond, affecting not only her but her children and the people she interacted with, creating a chain of pain that extended far beyond anything I could have imagined. And the voice of Jesus resonated in my conscience with a force that pierced me like a lightning bolt. These words from Matthew chapter 25 verses 42 and 43: For I was hungry and you gave me no food, I was thirsty and you gave me no drink, I was a stranger and you did not welcome me, I was naked and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison and you did not visit me. Yet the way he conveyed this to me was not like a simple scriptural quote, it was like a piercing accusation, showing me that every time I had failed to love one of the least of these, I had failed to love him directly. He showed me another moment, a conversation with a younger sister in our congregation who had come to me struggling with deep doubts about her faith. She confided in me that she no longer felt God's presence in prayer, that the rituals had become empty for her, and that she wondered if she had truly been called to religious life. I remembered my response. I had told her that doubt was a temptation from the devil, that she needed to pray more, fast more, and submit more completely to obedience. I assigned her additional penances and gave her verses on perseverance. And now, Jesus was showing me the terrible truth of what I had done. I saw how my words, which I had believed to be pious and right, crushed the last vestige of hope in her heart. I saw how she felt utterly alone, misunderstood, and trapped in a system that had no room for her genuine struggles. I saw how my religious rigidity pushed her into a depression so deep that she contemplated taking her own life, and although she eventually left the convent and survived, the damage my words caused left scars on her soul that remained for years. Jesus made me experience her despair, her loneliness, and her sense of being rejected, not just by me, but by God himself, and he conveyed something to me that completely shattered me, that I had had the opportunity to be his hands, extended in love toward that suffering soul, but instead, he had used religion as a hammer to drive her deeper into her pit of despair. Each of these actions had real, lasting consequences that rippled through time, affecting not only those individuals but everyone with whom they interacted. My choices mattered, each one mattered in a way I had never grasped when I made them. Then the vision shifted, and Jesus showed me something that filled me with a terror unlike any I had ever known. He showed me what he called the fabric of souls, an infinitely complex, interconnected web of all humanity. It was like a cosmic tapestry woven from threads of light, each thread representing a human soul, all linked together in patterns of indescribable beauty. But what horrified me was seeing the current state of that fabric. Large sections were dark, the threads had lost their luminosity and turned gray, almost black. Other threads were tangled in tight, ugly knots, creating areas of dark density that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And most terrible of all was seeing threads that had snapped completely, breaking away from the fabric and falling into a darkness that lay beyond the tapestry's edges. With an urgency that pierced to the very core of my being, Jesus conveyed to me that each of those dark threads represented a soul that had chosen selfishness over love, hatred over compassion, indifference over connection, and those choices were not neutral. They were not merely personal preferences devoid of consequences. Every choice of darkness weakened the entire fabric, making it harder for other threads to hold their light and creating fractures in the very structure of spiritual reality. I saw how a single act of deliberate cruelty sent out waves of darkness that rippled through dozens of other threads, weakening them and tempting them toward that same darkness. I saw how indifference to the suffering of others created cold zones in the fabric where light could barely penetrate. I saw how spiritual pride, exactly the kind of pride I had cultivated for decades, created barriers that prevented light from flowing freely between souls. And then Jesus showed me the threads that had completely snapped, and what I saw filled me with absolute dread. These were not simply souls who had made mistakes or were struggling with sin. These were threads that had consciously and deliberately chosen to reject all love, all light, all connection. They had chosen absolute selfishness, pure hatred, and cruelty as a way of life. Their repeated choices, made one after another throughout their lives, despite countless opportunities to change, had resulted in a terrible consequence. They had severed themselves from the fabric, they had cut themselves off from the source of love that sustained all existence. Jesus let me feel what those souls were experiencing, and it was the most horrifying thing I could imagine. It was not a physical fire, as paintings of hell depict, it was something far worse. It was the experience of being utterly alone, totally cut off from any connection, any love, any light. It was existing in a darkness they had created themselves, a darkness made of their own concentrated hatred, their own distilled selfishness, and that darkness had no end because they themselves, they were the source of it. As long as they existed in that state of utter rejection of love, the darkness would continue. She told me something that shattered me. That although the door back to love always technically remained open, these souls had locked themselves so deeply into their own darkness that they could no longer see the door. They no longer remembered that there had ever been light. They had become so identified with their selfishness, so consumed by their hatred, that they had lost the very capacity to desire anything different. It wasn't that God had condemned or rejected them, it was that they had condemned themselves to this fate, through their own repeated choices, made one after another, rejecting every opportunity for grace that had been offered to them. Jesus then showed me the origin of that darkness and made me understand that it did not begin with terrible, obvious acts of evil. It began with small choices, with decisions that seemed insignificant at the time. It began when someone chose personal comfort over helping another in need. It began when someone decided to hold a grudge rather than forgive. It began when someone prioritized their own pride over the truth. It began when someone saw another's suffering and deliberately looked away. Those small choices of selfishness were like the first cracks in a building, invisible at first, but which, with time and repetition, became structural fractures that eventually caused total collapse. He showed me how those small choices of darkness turned into habits, habits turned into patterns, patterns turned into character, and character eventually determined eternal destiny. I saw with horror that many of the people whose threads were now broken had started exactly where I was, with small choices to place religious rules above human compassion, to value correct doctrine more than genuine love. The difference was that they had continued down that path, hardening their hearts more and more with each selfish choice, until finally their hearts became as hard as stone, incapable of feeling compassion, incapable of loving. And Jesus conveyed to me, with an urgency that shook me to my very soul, that the time to choose was not infinite, that there was a point of no return, that it was possible for a soul to harden its heart so much that it lost the very capacity to repent. He showed me the words of Hebrews, chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, "If you hear his voice today, do not harden your hearts." The today was now, not tomorrow, not some future day, now. Every moment was an opportunity to choose love or selfishness, to strengthen the light or feed the darkness, and those choices carried eternal weight. Then, I was shown something that gave me hope amidst that terror. I was shown threads glowing intensely, souls that had chosen love time and again, despite hardships, despite pain, despite the temptations of selfishness. And the most surprising thing was seeing that many of these glowing threads did not belong to religious people, not to priests, nuns, or spiritual leaders, but to ordinary people who, in their daily lives, consistently chose compassion over indifference, forgiveness over vengeance, and generosity over greed. I saw a nurse working double shifts at a hospital, exhausted to the bone, yet still taking the time to hold the hands of dying patients who had no family. I saw a teacher at an impoverished school using his own money to buy supplies for students who couldn't afford them, staying after class to help those who were struggling, and seeing potential in children whom everyone else had written off. I saw a single mother working 3 jobs to support her children, who, despite her own poverty, shared the little food she had, with neighbors who were worse off than she was. I saw a man who had been deeply wounded and betrayed, yet chose to forgive when it would have been far easier to harbor bitterness. These people would likely never appear on the news, nor would society ever recognize them as special, yet their threads shone with an intensity surpassing that of many famous religious leaders, and I witnessed the impact of their loving choices. Every genuine act of compassion sent triples of golden light through the tapestry, strengthening not only their own thread but also the threads of everyone they touched. Those waves of light helped loosen the knots of selfishness in other threads. They brought a measure of luminosity to the gray, weakened threads. They forged new connections between souls that had previously been isolated. They were like antibodies of light fighting the infection of darkness that threatened to consume the entire tapestry. Jesus then conveyed something to me that completely transformed my understanding of salvation. He showed me that salvation was not a singular event occurring when someone accepted certain beliefs or performed specific rituals. Salvation was an ongoing process, a series of choices made moment by moment, day after day, throughout a lifetime. Each time someone chose love over selfishness, they were participating in their own salvation and the salvation of the world. Each time someone chose the opposite, they were participating in their own condemnation and the weakening of humanity's entire tapestry. He made me realize that my 3 decades of religious life guaranteed nothing if my daily choices were not rooted in genuine love. He showed me the words from Matthew, chapter 7, verses 21 through 23. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you, depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" He made me feel the terrible weight of those words, to understand that it was entirely possible to dedicate an entire life to religious service and yet still be lost if that service was not motivated by real love, but rather by spiritual pride, a desire for recognition, or fear of punishment. The question was not how many rosaries I had prayed, how many masses I had attended, or how many years I had spent in the convent. The question was whether I had truly loved, and Jesus showed me, with brutal honesty, that much of what I called love was actually pride in disguise. It was the desire to feel morally superior, it was the satisfaction of following the rules while judging others who did not. It was not genuine love that cared for the well-being of the other, regardless of whether they met my religious standards or not. Jesus then showed me something that filled me with a desperate urgency. He showed me the current state of the world, and I saw that the fabric was weakening at a rate alarming. Large sections were turning dark, more threads were snapping, knots of selfishness were multiplying and tightening ever more. I saw entire societies built upon systems of institutionalized selfishness where greed was celebrated as a virtue, where compassion was viewed as weakness, and where the suffering of millions was accepted as the necessary price for the comfort of the few. I saw religions, including my own, that had been corrupted from within, using God's name to amass power and wealth while ignoring the poor and vulnerable they were supposed to serve. I saw how technology, which could connect people in love, was isolating them further, creating bubbles of hatred and division where only voices confirming one's own prejudices were heard. I saw the planet itself being destroyed by boundless avarice, resources depleted, ecosystems collapsing, all because humanity had chosen short-term gain over responsibility toward future generations. And I saw that a critical point was approaching, a moment when, if enough threads snapped and enough darkness accumulated, the entire fabric could collapse. It was not a prophecy about a specific date for the end of the world. It was a warning about the direction humanity was taking and the inevitable consequences if it did not change course soon. It was conveyed to me that the time for choosing was not infinite, that there was real urgency, and that every moment wasted in selfishness and indifference accelerated the fabric's deterioration. The words of Romans 13:11 were shown to me, and do this, understanding the present time, the hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. Jesus made me understand that although God's love is infinite and unconditional, the consequences of our choices are real and inevitable. He showed me that there exists a spiritual law as immutable as the law of gravity, the law of sowing and reaping. Galatians, chapter 6, verse 7. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked, for whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Every action generates consequences, every choice carries weight, every thought contributes to the reality we create, both individually and collectively. If we sow selfishness, we will reap isolation and suffering. If we sow love, we will reap connection and abundant life. There is no way to escape this law. No religious ritual can annul it. No amount of prayer can erase the consequences of a life lived in selfishness. God's grace is always available to help us change direction, to heal us, and to restore us. But it does not eliminate the consequences of our past choices. Those consequences ripple through the fabric of life, affecting others and creating realities that persist long after we have physically died. I was shown that I was responsible not only for my own choices but also for the impact those choices had on every soul I had touched. The young mother I drove away from the faith. The sister I pushed toward depression. All the people who found in me an obstacle rather than a bridge to divine love. I would have to face the full weight of those consequences, not as an arbitrary punishment, but as the inevitable reality of what my choices had created. And Jesus made me feel the pain those consequences caused, not only to the people directly affected but to him as well. Every soul that turned away from love was a wound in his own heart. Every thread that darkened or snapped represented a loss he felt deeply. The sadness I had initially seen in his eyes now made perfect sense. It was the anguish of a creator watching his beloved creations destroy themselves, and one another, through their own choices. Knowing that although he constantly reached out his hand, many deliberately rejected it. Then, the presence of Jesus intensified, conveying the central message I needed to carry back. He told me that the time for playing games with religion was over. The time for settling for empty rituals and superficial beliefs had ended. He showed me that what was at stake was not merely personal comfort or individual happiness, but the eternal destiny of countless souls and the very integrity of the fabric sustaining all existence. He made me understand that everyone who heard my story would face a choice, a real choice with real consequences. They could continue living for themselves, prioritizing their own comfort, desires, and agendas, regardless of the cost to others. That path led inevitably toward darkness, toward the weakening of their own thread and contributing to the collapse of the fabric. Or, they could awaken to the reality of their interconnectedness with all other souls. They could begin making conscious choices rooted in love, even when it was difficult. They could become sources of light that strengthened the fabric rather than weakening it. Yet, he made it absolutely clear to me that failing to choose was also a choice, that moral neutrality did not exist. Indifference was, in itself, a choice for darkness. Refusing to act when witnessing suffering was an active participation in that suffering. He showed me the words from Revelation 3:16, "But because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth." Spiritual lukewarmness, mediocre religiosity, a faith that failed to transform daily life into concrete acts of love, all of this was rejected not because God was cruel, but because it was utterly futile. It served no purpose, it helped no one, it did not strengthen the fabric, it merely occupied space that could have been used for true light. Jesus conveyed to me that I was being sent back, not to make people feel good about themselves, nor to offer a soft, comforting message that required no real change. I was being sent back to warn them, to shake them from their spiritual slumber, and to make them see the urgency of the times in which we live. He told me that many would not want to hear this message, that they would prefer the comfortable lies telling them that everything is fine, that God loves them no matter what, so they need not change anything in their lives. Yet those lies were leading souls to perdition, they were weakening the fabric to the point of rupture. He showed me that true love must sometimes be harsh, it must speak uncomfortable truths, it must confront selfishness and call it what it is. He reminded me of the words of Ezekiel, chapter 3, verses 18 and 19, "When I say to the wicked, you shall surely, you will die, and if you do not warn him or speak to him, so that the wicked one is warned of his evil way and may live, he will die for his wickedness, but I will hold you accountable for his blood. But if you warn the wicked one and he does not turn from his wickedness and his evil way, he will die for his wickedness, yet you will have saved your own soul." I understood that my responsibility was not to make people accept or like me, but to tell them the truth, even if they hated me for it. If I gave a warning and people chose not to listen, that was their choice and their consequence. But if I failed to warn them, if I remained silent out of fear of rejection or a desire for acceptance, then I would be responsible for the souls that were lost, because they never heard the truth I could have told them. And then Jesus showed me my future if I chose to obey this calling. I saw that it would not be easy, that I would face rejection from the religious institution that had been my home for decades, that many would call me a heretic and a liar, and that I would lose the security and comfort of the life I had known. But I also saw that every sacrifice would be worth it if even a single thread that was growing dark began to shine again because it heard the message and chose to change. He showed me that my life no longer belonged to me, that it had been bought at a price, and that I now existed solely to serve the purpose of strengthening the fabric and helping souls choose the light before it was too late. He shared with me the words from 1 Corinthians, chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you were bought at a price, therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." I understood that every breath I took from then on needed to be used to glorify God, not through empty rituals, but through concrete acts of love that would strengthen the tapestry and help others see the truth before their own. And this time there was no resistance within me. I understood the mission, I accepted the cost, and I was willing to pay whatever price was necessary to fulfill what had been entrusted to me. The light began to fade, the tapestry of souls began to recede from my view, but before it vanished completely, Jesus gave me one last image that was seared into my soul as if with a red-hot iron. He showed me two diverging paths, one led toward more light, more connection, more life, the other led toward more darkness, more isolation, more death. And he showed me that humanity was standing at the crossroads between these two paths, and the direction we would take depended on the choices each individual soul made in the coming years. There was no third path, no neutral zone, only these two options with their respective, inevitable consequences. The return to my body was violent and painful, like being compressed into a space that it was infinitely too small, after having experienced boundless freedom. The pain in my chest returned, magnified. I felt the electricity of the defibrillators sending shocks through my body. I heard the frantic voices of doctors and nurses. I felt hands pressing against my chest. When I opened my eyes, the hospital's fluorescent lights temporarily blinded me. Everything was chaotic, confusing, overwhelming. I heard someone say that I had been in cardiac arrest for nearly 8 minutes, that medically, I shouldn't have survived, that it was a miracle, but I knew it wasn't a random miracle. It was a mission, it was a responsibility, a calling I could not ignore without terrible consequences for my own soul. The days that followed were an intense internal battle. Physically, I was recovering. But spiritually, I was at war. The part of me that had spent 32 years in the comfort of institutional religious life wanted to return to that security. I wanted to forget what I had seen and simply carry on with the familiar routine, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fabric weakening, I saw the thread snapping, I saw the urgency of the moment. I couldn't ignore it, I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I had seen. I knew I had a choice, just as everyone has a choice, and that mine would have eternal consequences. I could obey the call and face everything it entailed, or I could remain silent and live out the rest of my life knowing I had failed at the one thing that truly mattered. Viewed from that perspective, the choice wasn't actually difficult. I slowly began to change the way I lived and served. When young novices came to me with doubts, I no longer gave them canned answers. Instead, I spoke to them about the urgency of choosing real love over empty religiosity. When we worked with the poor, I no longer focused on preaching morality to them, but on truly seeing their souls, recognizing their dignity and treating them as the precious threads of the tapestry that they truly were. I began to speak more openly about the failings of our religious institution, about how we had lost sight of Jesus' central message, and about how we needed a radical reform to bring us back to what truly mattered. Unsurprisingly, this was not well received. Some of the older sisters whispered that the cardiac arrest had affected my brain. The Mother Superior summoned me several times to warn me against straying from established teachings. Yet there were also people, both inside and outside the convent, who reached out to tell me that my words had touched something deep within them, that for the first time they felt someone was telling them the truth rather than offering comforting religious lies. I saw how certain threads that had grown dim began to glow again when they heard the message of urgency and genuine choice, and that gave me the strength to carry on despite the opposition. Eventually, I reached the point where I knew I could not stay. 44 hours 37 minutes, within the structure of institutional religious life, not because the institution was entirely bad, but because the restrictions and expectations would prevent me from speaking the full truth that needed to be told. I left the convent a year ago. I traded my habit for ordinary clothes and left behind the title of Sister Gabriella. It was terrifying, yet liberating. Now I work with people whom the institutional church has rejected or ignored, people whose threads are most at risk of snapping. I speak openly about what I saw, about the urgency of the moment, and about the real consequences of our choices. Some call me a heretic, others say I am deluded, but that does not stop me, because I saw what is at stake. I saw the fabric weakening, I saw the threads breaking, I saw that time is not infinite. What I have learned this year is that living according to the truth revealed to me is infinitely harder than simply following religious rules, but it is also infinitely more important. Every day, I face the temptation to soften the message, to make it more palatable, to tell people that everything will be fine regardless of what they choose. But whenever I feel that temptation, I remember the broken threads falling into darkness. I remember the sadness in Jesus' eyes. I remember that I have a responsibility that goes beyond my own comfort or social acceptance. And now, I address you directly, you who are reading or listening to these words. I did not share this story to entertain you or to win your admiration. I shared it because I was commanded to warn you. Because what is at stake is too important to keep silent about. You have a choice to make, a real choice with real, eternal consequences. you can continue living as you have been, prioritizing your own comfort, your own desires, and your own agenda, without truly caring how your choices affect others or the entire fabric of existence. You can continue with a superficial religiosity that makes you feel good about yourselves without requiring any real change in how you live. You can remain lukewarm, neither cold nor hot, simply existing without contributing real light to the world. But know this with absolute certainty, that path leads inevitably to the weakening of your own thread, toward darkness, and toward eventual separation from the source of love, the only thing that gives true life. The consequences may not be immediate, you might live for decades in selfish comfort, but those consequences are inevitable and eternal. Or, you can wake up right now, in this very moment, you can begin making different choices that prioritize real love over personal comfort, that genuinely care for the well-being of others, even when it comes at a cost. You can become sources of light that strengthen the fabric rather than weakening it. You can live in such a way that your thread shines brightly, sending out waves of love that help other threads shine, too, but this requires a conscious, constant choice, moment by moment. It is not something you do once and then forget, it is a complete way of life that must be renewed every day, and I want you to understand something crucial. The time to choose is not infinite, you have no guarantee of tomorrow, you do not know when your own heart will stop beating and you will find yourself before that presence of love and truth, where nothing can be hidden. You do not know how much longer the fabric can bear the weight of the accumulating darkness before reach the breaking point. The urgency is real. Jesus did not send me back to tell you that you have all the time in the world, he sent me back to tell you that time is running out, that every moment wasted in selfishness and indifference is a lost opportunity that will never return. James, chapter 4, verse 14, says, "What is your life? It is truly a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes." Your life is short, terribly short, compared to eternity, and the choices you make within this brief mist determine your eternal reality. That is not emotional manipulation or religious control, it is simply the truth of how spiritual reality works. The consequences are real. Hell is real, not as a place of arbitrary physical torture, but as the inevitable state of a soul that has completely separated itself from love through its own repeated choices. Heaven is real, not as a luxury resort in the clouds, but as a state of complete union with divine love, experienced by those who chose to be conduits of that love during their lives. And right now, with every thought, every word, and every action, you are choosing the direction in which you are moving. Do not wait until it is too late. Do not wait until your heart is so hardened that you can no longer feel compassion. Do not wait until your thread is so tangled in knots of selfishness that it can no longer be unraveled. Do not wait until the consequences of your past choices have created a reality from which you cannot escape. The time to change is now, today, this very instant. 2 Corinthians, chapter 6, verse 2, says, "Behold, now is the acceptable time, behold, now is the day of salvation, not tomorrow, not when circumstances are perfect, not when you feel ready, but now, because tomorrow may never come, circumstances will never be perfect, and you will never feel completely ready. If you wait until you feel ready to choose love over selfishness, you will wait until it is too late. The choice must be made now, from where you stand, with all your imperfections and doubts, but it must be made, and made with utter seriousness, understanding that what is at stake is your eternal destiny and the destiny of all the souls you will touch throughout the rest of your lives. Your choices do not affect only you, they affect the entire fabric. Every choice of love strengthens others, every choice of selfishness weakens them. You are responsible not only for your own souls but for the impact your lives have on all others. That is a terrifying responsibility, yet also an immense honor, because it means your life matters. Your choices carry cosmic weight, and you can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. I tell you all this not to terrify you, but to awaken you. Proper fear, reverent awe before the real consequences of our choices, is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs, chapter 9, verse 10, but fear is only the beginning, it is not the final destination. The final destination is love. It is choosing love not out of fear of punishment, but because you recognize that it is the only thing that holds real value, the only thing that transcends death, the only thing that strengthens the tapestry and brings true life. I implore you to take this message seriously. Do not dismiss it as merely an interesting story or the personal experience of a woman who underwent a traumatic medical event. This is more than that. This is a direct warning about the reality in which you live, about the spiritual forces operating behind the veil of the physical, and about the destiny that awaits you based on the choices you make every day. You are going to die, that is inevitable. The only question is, what kind of souls will you be when that moment arrives? Will you have spent your lives strengthening your thread through constant choices of love, forging deep connections with other souls, and contributing light to the tapestry? Or will you have spent your lives weakening your thread through constant selfishness, creating isolation, and contributing darkness? The answer to that question will determine your experience in eternity, not because God is arbitrary or cruel, but because the natural consequences of our choices extend beyond the grave. You cannot escape the law of sowing and reaping. What you sow, you will reap, now and forever. I conclude with one final, urgent plea. Look honestly at your lives today. Do not deceive yourselves with comfortable rationalizations about why your selfishness is justified or why your indifference is understandable. Face the truth of who you really are, what you are truly choosing, and where you are truly heading. If you do not like what you see, change now, not tomorrow. Change is possible. God's grace is available to help you, but you must choose it. You must decide that your personal comfort matters less than the well-being of others, that your selfish desires matter less than the integrity of the tapestry, and that your pride matters less than the truth. You must be willing to sacrifice, to endure discomfort, and to do difficult things out of love for others. That is what it truly means to follow Jesus, not merely affirming correct beliefs or attending religious services, but living a life of sacrificial love that strengthens the fabric and helps others find the light. The cost is high, but the consequences of failing to pay that price are infinitely higher. Choose wisely, choose now, choose love, for time is running out, the fabric is weakening, and your response to this message will have consequences that echo throughout eternity. Do not waste this opportunity, do not ignore or postpone it. Your eternal soul, and the souls of countless others, depend on the choices you make from this moment forward. May God grant you the wisdom to choose rightly and the strength to live out that choice every day until your last breath. Gabriella, thank you for your courage. Thank you for daring to share a testimony that is so profound, so uncomfortable, and so necessary. We know that recounting this experience was not easy and that speaking the truth often comes at a very high cost. We honor your sincerity and your obedience to that calling that marked your life forever. The Bible reminds us in Galatians 6-7, do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked, a man reaps what he sows. This story leaves us with a truth impossible to ignore. Faith is not a title, a habit, or a religious custom. Faith is a daily choice, choosing love over selfishness, compassion over indifference, light over darkness. And to you, having reached the end of this video, thank you for staying. It was no coincidence that you heard this message. May these words not remain merely a striking story, but serve as an honest invitation to examine your life, your decisions, and the path you are building each day. May God bless you, grant you the wisdom to choose well, and give you the strength to live out that choice with integrity and love. See you in the next video. Amen.